Talk about app shortcuts. My name is Caren. This is my first time in Denver. I'm originally from San Francisco, so we get like no days of summer, so this is amazing. But yeah, so app shortcuts was announced like in 7.1, so I feel like it didn't get much fanfare, and a lot of people don't know about it, and so a lot of people don't implement it or don't even know like that's a feature in their Android phones. So I thought it'd be a cool talk to kind of see how easy it is to implement these shortcuts and what you could do with them, because they could be really cool. So what are app shortcuts? Because some people thought that this talk was going to be about like widgets and that kind of stuff. But app shortcuts is actually the thing that happens when you long press on a launcher icon like this, and then you get like a list of things that you could possibly do in the app within one click. So it's basically like bookmarks for app, but they could be a whole lot smarter. So how many people already knew about app shortcuts before coming here? Oh, okay, mostly everybody. So hopefully this talk isn't too beginner level for you, and you'll learn a thing or two. How many people have actually implemented app shortcuts for the apps in production? Nice, cool. So yeah, the motivation behind app shortcuts basically like as developers, we want to take the user into certain parts of the app that they might not know about, and we also want to give them an easier way to access certain parts of the app. So by using app shortcuts, you could literally take them into the app with one click. Something that could take like a couple clicks or a lot of scrolls could be really simplified. So these are a couple examples I found. It turns out that not a lot of apps are really implementing app shortcuts for now. Mostly Google apps, as expected. Gmail has some cool stuff, but they're not as cool because in the Gmail one, as you can see, you could only like compose a new email. You could go into certain accounts for your email. The Evernote one is also pretty simple. For Pandora, it's a little cooler. It seems like these icons that they have here are updated based on what you last listened to, or maybe like the stations you listen to very frequently. So those were pretty cool. So a little bit overview of what we're going to talk about today. We're going to kind of talk about different kinds of shortcuts you can create. There's dynamic ones and there's static ones. We're going to take a look at how to create these shortcuts with some code samples so you can see how incredibly easy it is to create them. And then we're going to talk about how you can make it really cool but with dynamic shortcuts. And then we're going to talk about some updates that were announced at Google I/O about shortcuts. So when I learn about something new, I always like to think about it in terms of examples. So the example I came up with this time was, imagine we were all Netflix developers, which is pretty cool, right? So the first thing that I thought about when I thought about Netflix is how they implemented downloadable content. Because I thought it was a really cool feature, right? Because now you could download content, you could watch it on the road, you could watch it at the gym. So that's great. We implemented this awesome feature. But now, like, I remember the first time I tried to find my download content, it was like so incredibly difficult. I had to open the app, I had to scroll around a bit, and then click random things before I finally found what I was looking for. And then a day later, I would try to go back and find my download content, and I have to go through the same process of like clicking around, scrolling around, trying to do something that I already did before but forgot how to do. So this would be a great example of when we could probably implement shortcuts for our users that takes them into the downloadable content within one click, right? So getting started, the first thing to know about app shortcuts are that they're basically programmed through intents. Intents are the pretty basic concept in Android. It's used to send data around and kind of start different things. So example is like maybe you want to start a new activity on a button click. You could pass some extra messaging when you're starting that new activity. You could either do it through the code or you could do it through XML file. So when you're actually creating these shortcuts, there's a couple of things you can do to customize what you want to do. You could customize the icon that shows up, so those little circle things. You customize the label that shows up, so what shows up here. So the thing about this example here is like, you see these dot, dot, dots, it's probably not the best, but they didn't do anything about that. But you could do that by setting like a short label and a long label. And then you could set the intent you want for each button to happen when you click on it. So those are the three main things you could do when you're creating shortcuts. And then the second thing to know is that there's two kinds. There's static and dynamic ones, right? Static, as it implies, is defined in a resource file, so you can't change it. They're static. Dynamic are published at runtime, which means you could always change them, right? Because they're updated through the code itself, not through any XML files. So you could be running like background tests or anything like that. So now we're going to take a look at how incredibly easy it is to create a static shortcut. So the first thing you have to do is you create an XML file. You call it shortcuts, you call it whatever you want. And then you have this little block of code. So the first thing you want to say is, okay, it's enabled. You want to give it an ID, which is just for internal use only. And then you can set a long label and a short label. So labels are meant for like how big the screen sizes are. So depending on whether they have enough room to fit the long label, if they don't have enough room for the long label to show up, you can display the short label instead. And then the most important part is giving an intent. This app, if you don't set an intent for this, you'll actually get crashes. So you can't like just define a shortcut and not have an intent. Otherwise, you're gonna have an app crash. And then, so for this intent specific shortcut, I'm just gonna open like a detail activity or something like that. And then we have to, in our Android manifest file, we have to point to that this XML file that we had created earlier. So here I'm saying, okay, I do have app shortcuts, and I'm defining it all in this XML file called shortcuts. So that's it. That was literally it. That was like less than 15 lines of code, and we already have something like this. So you long press on the launcher icon, and you come up with these shortcuts, and you launch it, and it just goes to an activity. So that's really, really simple, right? But the cool part about shortcuts is dynamic ones that could always be changing. So the thing with dynamic shortcuts is it's created at runtime, right? So it runs at some part of your code. You can run it in onCreate method of your activity, or you can run it when your user does some action. So the first thing to know is that the shortcut manager is this really, really useful class. It has all the methods you would ever want. And when you create the shortcut, it's a lot like creating the static ones that we talked about earlier. So you set the label, the short one, the long one. You set an icon. If you don't set an icon, you'll get a default icon from Android. And then you set an intent about what you want to do. And then you kind of just say, OK, I created my shortcut. Now set all these shortcuts that I created as my dynamic shortcuts. And like I said before, since these are created at runtime, you can literally create them at any time, right? So in this specific case, I'm creating it on the onCreate method for my home activity. So that means that if my home activity was a launcher activity, every time the user opened my app and they went into the home activity, this method would run, and this method of creating dynamic shortcuts would run. So again, that was like about 10 lines of code, and easily with that, we have another shortcut. I mean, right now it's really boring because we're basically doing the same thing, right? At this point, since we're not doing much here, I could basically make this a static shortcut as well. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about the cooler things. So like I said, dynamic shortcuts are created at runtime, so you could create them at any time. And since users are always doing different kinds of actions, you kind of want to cater the app to their needs, right? So the thing is, every user can have a different dynamic shortcut based on what they've been doing and what you want them to do. So I thought of a simple example, which doesn't do much, but say we have a shortcut that opened home activity the first time, right? So we want to expose the user to the home activity. So now we want to say, OK, the user has used this home activity, and they've been taken there. So maybe we want to update our shortcut to open something else, right? So we want to expose them to different parts of the app. So this is our example of how we would possibly do that. So the method I'm going to be implementing is I'm going to call it update dynamic shortcuts. And the first thing we have to do is we have to get an intent. So OK, so whenever I launch an activity from this shortcut, I'm going to say, OK, I'm going to check to see if that was launched from the shortcut. And if it is, I'm going to do all this stuff. I'm going to create a new shortcut in the same exact way that I created one before. And then I'm going to call this magic method called remove all my dynamic shortcuts and then add these new ones. So the main methods here to take into concern is remove all dynamic shortcuts and then add dynamic shortcuts again. So if you look at the GIF here, what happens is the first time it says detail shortcuts and it goes into details. And then since we registered that we've done that already, the second time it's going to be this burger icon. And it's going to be a second detail activity. And then it's updated. So literally, like the user has not updated their APK. All they did was go into something, and we recorded what they did, and we updated our apps to cater to their needs. So this is great, but the thing to always think about is even though you're building cool stuff, you always want to still think about the user, right? So we want to create a good user experience. And like, as you could probably already know or see right now, app shortcuts is like deep linking. So like if a user gets a notification, they tap on the notification, it's kind of like that, where you deep link them into a specific part of your app, right? So if we're going back to the example of we're being Netflix developers, so we created this app shortcut, and now we launched users directly into their downloaded content. So that's great. But like users are kind of finicky, right? You can never really predict what they're going to do. So say they go into their downloaded content through this app shortcut, and then they're like, OK, no, that's not actually what I want to do. I want to like kind of browse around. So they press the back button. And now they end up exiting the app because like the way you program your app shortcut is they just launched it to the specific activity, but you didn't actually like think about what they were going to do after that, right? So now they're really confused, and they're probably sad, and they don't know what's going on with your app. So this is where we can implement some backstacks. And backstacks are actually, I think, a pretty common concept in terms of like deep linking. But the way you would create a backstack when you're creating shortcuts is just through multiple intents. So you're building intents on top of each other. So in this case, the first thing in my XML file, I have an intent to open the home activity, and then I put another intent on top of that to go to the detail activity. So what happens in this case is, since I have these two intents built on top of each other, I'm going to go into the detail activity, and then, but right under my stack of the detail activity is going to be the home activity. So this is the same exact way for dynamic shortcuts. You create two intents and build it on top of each other. But if you'll notice, for my first intent, I actually set this flag for flag activity clear task. So what this does is it clears all, if the user has been in your app before, it's going to clear all the activities that were already launched. So they don't go into this weird loop of like, okay, I go to like my detail activity, I go to my home activity, and you press the back button again, and now I'm in like some random activity, even though I thought I would exit the app, right? So the good thing about this is you have to do this for dynamic shortcuts, but if you were doing it the static way, this is already done for you automatically. So dynamic shortcuts, like we said, it can be updated at any time, right? So now we create these backstacks, but now we want to update them. So we kind of want to take a look at what the user's been doing, what happens after they do something, and you could do it in the background. So say like you could run it like every 2 hours, like, okay, check the user to see what have they done, or every 2 hours, check if our app wants to display something new to a user, or every 2 hours, maybe link them to a new part of the app, like the store. Or you could do it like from an alarm. So say every morning the user wakes up at 7. So your app could actually listen for that and then set new shortcuts for them. The other thing to know is a lot of things are backed up and restored for your app, right? There's a specific, I forget specifically what the setting is, but in your XML you can say, okay, I want to allow users to back up their data for my app. But since dynamic shortcuts are published at runtime, you can't back up dynamic shortcuts because it's hard to know like what exactly was there before they deleted their app, right? So the thing to do in this case is you want to call getDynamicShortcuts every time your app launches. And if your app launches and you call getDynamicShortcuts and returns nothing, then this is probably when you would want to rebuild like new shortcuts, right? The other thing to know was there is a limit to the number of times you could call like set or add dynamic shortcuts and update shortcuts in the background. So what it means when it says your app is in the background, it's like it's not in the user is not currently using it, right? They're probably in another part of the app or they're not using it at all. So when you're developing this, you might be thinking, okay, I'm going to update this constantly, but what happens is it's going to stop updating at a certain time, and you're going to think your app is buggy, but it's actually just hitting this limit. So what you can do when you're developing is you could go into the developer options to turn off this limit, or you can reset it through ADB. Has anybody run into this problem yet? Yeah, I'm not sure what the number of times they say is, but they do say this a lot. But I haven't actually run into it, so I don't know what the actual number is. Okay, so now we know about dynamic and static shortcuts, but like when would you kind of want to use the two, right? So I think static shortcuts are good for actions that remain the same, like going to a specific part of the app or setting an alarm. And you should allow users to access the important parts of your app through these. Dynamic shortcuts are probably based on actions that the user performs, right? Or context-sensitive actions. So say every time the user gets home, you want to show them this. Or every time the user wakes up, you want to show them this. So back to the Netflix example again. For the static shortcut, I would probably do it for launching downloaded content, because that's just one place where you want to go in the app. For the dynamic shortcut, it could be anything. It could be something like, okay, resume the episode of Last Watched Show. And this will always be different, right? Because the user is always watching different kinds of shows. Or it could be like, go to a random show that we want to show you that we think you'll like based on our algorithm. So it could literally be anything. So as I mentioned a little bit before, Shortcuts Manager is like the really important class that you really want to utilize when you're implementing app shortcuts. So we're going to take a look at some of the useful things that it can do. So one of the most useful things that Shortcuts Manager offers is this method called report shortcut use. So you can call this method every time the user selects a certain shortcut with an ID, or when a user completes an equivalent action within the app. So the good thing about this is that when you call report shortcut use every time users perform certain actions, then you know exactly like how they're using the shortcuts or if they're even using it at all. And the other magical thing is that the Android launcher app itself will use this information to determine like what kind of shortcuts should appear for your app. So this method is really useful. Another thing to know is you could also order shortcuts with the shortcuts manager. So they're usually ordered manually, but you can set it, the static shortcuts always come first, right? Because they're the ones that are already built when the APK is built. But the dynamic shortcuts, you could order them by set rank. And I think this is actually the coolest part about shortcuts in general, is that you could pin your own shortcuts and create a shortcut of a shortcut, right? So in this example, I'm in the Google Maps app. And since they have like 2 different types of shortcuts I can use, there's like a home one and there's like a work one, which navigates you to work or home. But you could actually pin it. So you like long click on the icon and then you drag it to your home screen. And now it's like a 1-click thing to go to your home, to navigate home, right? So this is something that your app can do as well. It's kind of like creating a widget, but a little different. And for some reason, there's no limit on the number of pin shortcuts users can create. And there's this weird like warning about like how users can create 500 like shortcuts all of the same thing, and you don't want them to do that because they might start spamming your app. So you want to be careful of what you do with these shortcuts that are happening. Otherwise, if a user creates like 500 pin shortcuts and your shortcut for some reason runs a bunch of like background activities to call APIs from your app, that might create like some kind of bad consequences. But the cool thing about pin shortcuts is there were some new announcements made in Google I/O, and now you can call this new method request pin shortcut, and this will allow your app to dynamically pin shortcuts to a supported launcher. So what does that mean? So taking a look at the code first, the code looks something like this, where you build the icon very similar to what we did before, and then you call this method called request pin shortcut with the info and the intent, and you get this like magical screen automatically built for you. So that's what happens when you call request pin shortcut. You get this little dialog, and it says, okay, do you want to add this icon to the home screen? And that's the icon we created. And you could say add automatically, which will just put that icon on the screen, or you could drag it and drop it onto your home screen. So this is cool because since we're building these shortcuts dynamically, we're literally allowing the users to build their own shortcuts, right? As you can see, we use the methods setIcon and setShortLabel and setIntent. So these are all things that the user themselves can customize. They can customize their own icon, they can customize their own name of the app icon, and they can set their own intent. So you can allow the users to do anything. Like if you have a screen like this here, you could say, okay, you could ask the user what kind of app icon do you want. They could pick like a picture from their phone, or they could pick like a picture that you gave them. And then you could say, okay, what do you want to name their icon? And they can name it everything or anything they want. And then the intent part, they could also do anything. You could say like, okay, do you want to create an app shortcut for like going into a screen, or do you want to create like an app shortcut for doing some kind of action? So they could literally customize this in any way they want. So yeah, so I think this is actually the coolest part about app shortcuts. I don't think anybody, so this is not, this was just announced, so apps haven't used it yet, so I'm excited to see what kind of apps are going to do this cool thing. So one of the other things to think about is deprecating shortcuts. So sometimes you're going to have shortcuts that no longer are relevant anymore. But as developers, we actually don't have control over pin shortcuts. So where the user like puts on their home screen, we have no idea what they put. We can't just say, okay, delete this thing that the user pinned to their home screen. So a thing to note here is there is a method called setDisabledMessage. And what that does is if you have a shortcut that's disabled, you can show the user a certain message that says, okay, this shortcut is no longer supported. So one of the last things to know is like a lot of people I talked to didn't even know about app shortcuts at all. And we're Android developers, so we're pretty in the know about things. So that's how we know. But if you do build app shortcuts for your app, it's always good to like talk about it with your users, either in the release notes or creating some kind of like onboarding banner and telling them this is something they can do. So kind of wrapping things up, app shortcuts can really help drive user engagement. There's 2 types, static and dynamic kind. And you always want to create a good user experience by populating the backstacks. And you want to inform the users of this new ability that you put in your app. You want to make the users happy. So yeah, there's a pretty short talk. Is there any questions about this stuff or experiences people want to share about their app shortcuts? Cool. Well, yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks for sharing all your experiences.